Welcome, everyone, to the Midnight Charrette podcast, hosted by myself, David Lee, and Marina Bordarene, who is not me. You're a separate person.
What?
Across from me. Across from the table.
Are you sure I'm across from you?
No. Today, we're doing the introduction before we record to keep it seamless. Not in Grubhub, but keep it seamless. And I don't really know what's going to happen in the recording, so we'll find out. But if you're listening to this, you might be an architect or someone in that building profession. And, you know, to model architecture, draw architecture in the computer is a complicated thing to do, and you might not know which program to use because there's many different ones out there. Maybe there's a free one you think that would be good, but that's not very good because it's free. Maybe there's another one that's a subscription-based, and you don't really like the idea of paying an annual or monthly fee because it seems like a rip-off, which it kind of is.
I mean, hopefully you know what program to use. It's a matter of maybe you're thinking of switching program because the one you currently use sucks.
Okay.
Right?
If that's the case, you should check out ArchiCAD by Graphisoft. ArchiCAD is a BIM program. They've been around for quite some time, and they were created by architects. And so the workflow is more intuitive and easier than some other BIM programs out there. And they work well on Macs. They play well with other programs through different plugins for softwares like Rhinoceros and I believe also Grasshopper and V-Ray and SketchUp. So it's a great thing. You should check them out. So go to graphisoft.com to look for ArchiCAD.
And while you're at it on your browser, just keep punching NAAD.me. NAD, it's an online store curated by an architect who lives in Paris. And they are selling a lot of design goods that young contemporary designers from North Africa and the Middle East are making. It's a very, very interesting take on some more traditional culture. Very good prices, amazing stuff, great quality, and they renew their collections fairly often. So make sure to check it out, NAAD.me, and if you use the code MIDNIGHT at checkout, you get 15% off.
All right. So we, for a while now, have been thinking, we have these tips and tactics episodes, which you might already know of. So in the past, we've done ones about choosing the right undergraduate architecture school, how to create a portfolio, how to create a resume, things like this. And so we thought it would be interesting to have a discussion about computer softwares, which actually, that once I say that out loud, that doesn't sound interesting at all.
No, it sounds super boring.
So... Yeah, that's super boring. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty of it because this is not a tutorial. It's not meant to be that. But, using the computer has obviously become almost an essential part of being an architect or any other design professional today. And I think for a lot of, there's a lot of questions that practicing professionals have. So let's say architects who have been licensed for a bit of time and, actually produce or oversee the construction of buildings, as opposed to, let's say, a younger designer who hasn't had that experience, or maybe even younger than that, a student. But I think at all three of those levels, there's questions that are to be asked and potentially answered. So I figured we'd have a talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting to talk about it. There are so many out there and so many ways to work on different phases on all of them. Or like you're from a certain generation, you've been used to certain types of program. Now there is new ones. Switching, you're thinking of making a switch, right? So how to transition, I think, is also interesting.
Yeah, so why don't we start with maybe from the perspective of a younger designer, so one that's in school or about to graduate or something like that. So I think there's always computer classes in schools. It's pretty common. And in that class, you learn certain softwares and you have kind of mini assignments that are somewhat design-based, have some kind of design element to them. And that's how you're meant to learn program. The tough thing, and I think that's good for really basic, fundamental understanding the tools. So like if you don't know what the word orbit means in a 3D program, then you probably need to take, a class and to get you up to speed with that kind of basic stuff. But when it gets to higher level of executions, it becomes more difficult because each project has its own kind of tenor or shape or style or focus. And so what you'll find, especially if you're a student, I think, is that your knowledge of the software will be defined by the project itself. In other words, this project, what you're thinking for it in terms of design is going to lead you down a certain path. And in order to execute it the way that you want to execute it, you have to learn something new, a new piece of software or something new about a program you already know. So this is why it's really difficult in a teaching setting to say, well, I'm going to raise the skill level of all the students across an entire classroom or entire class, a year of students, right? The curricula, by having these classes where they learn programs, and now you can take that knowledge and use it for your project. It doesn't work that way because the projects tend to be more specific than that kind of generic knowledge. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think the way we've learned program when I was back in school in France was that it was kind of a beginner's class, like when you take a workout class, and they basically teach you the standard exercise and the proper way to do it, right? So like you said, how to orbit, how to switch from views and layers and like all those things. Mm-hmm. But what we had to do was kind of like dumb down stuff. Like, it was step 1 to step 10, and we were each doing the same thing just to know, how to learn where the tools were and like all of that stuff. And then for studios, we would have the option to use those programs we were learning or not, which was interesting because then you're a little more free, in a way. You're learning a skill, but you are not learning on how to apply it to a project. You kind of have to do that on your own.
Yeah, and this is the big question for teachers is how do you bridge that gap? Because what happens is, and actually I was just talking to someone who was a former dean of a school recently about this exact issue. And the issue being that you get a class of students, let's say 20 or 18 or 12, whatever, 20 students, right, in a design studio, and they all have different skill levels. How do you get the playing ground to be a little more even to bring up the students that are kind of struggling? And the model where you have a separate class that we've been talking about doesn't really work at that point. And so one solution is to bring in older students or recent graduates who know the programs to work with people on an individual basis. Again, so that the quote unquote workshop that they do with that one student, with that one person, is not a step 1 through 10 kind of thing, but it's a, what are you trying to do? Here's how you can do it quicker and better. And here's something else that might also fit within the scope of the project you're trying to execute. Having said that, teaching a class where the students have no knowledge of any computer programs at all is kind of a weird thing. I've done it before, and when you go to teach a first year class of any kind, like a studio, let's say, the struggle is trying to remember and put yourself in their shoes, which is so long ago for most of the teachers. That's difficult to do. But then to see it specifically with a computer program, you go to them and say, okay, you're going to orbit around this thing, you're going to rotate, and they just stare at you like, I'm going to orbit. You mean like space? Like Earth? I'm orbiting? What does that mean? So there's this big gap that you have to kind of conquer.
But do students still have, like axonometric and perspective drawing classes?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the school. Yeah, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I think now the tendency for schools is to adopt the use of computer software much, much earlier. I mean, obviously that makes sense. New technology takes some time before it becomes more ingrained in the program. But a lot of schools now, it's like you're using computers and softwares from year one, day one. And maybe we could discuss the pros and cons of that in a different recording. But so I think some schools also in the past have made the mistake of thinking that, this program right now is really popular. All the firms are using it from what we know. Because again, the schools, their knowledge of what the professions are doing, I never fully trust because they're getting it secondhand because they're obviously not really full-time practitioners, not serious ones, I don't think. But anyway, so and that's happened where they teach a program, let's say like Form Z, which I probably, if you have any, I don't know, it's not a program that anyone uses. I don't know if it's even around anymore. But
yeah, it is.
Oh, it is? Okay, great. But not used in architecture, really. And while there are certain fundamental principles or strategies or ideas that are shared between all 3D programs. At the same time, if you teach a class that's really heavily specific about, let's say, Form Z, I guarantee you like 40% of that information doesn't carry over to other programs. Again, there's baseline stuff, but it's a risky thing. And I think students also are always wondering, what programs do I need to learn for hiring purposes? What programs do I need to learn to stay relevant? And there are some now that I think are going to stay around, but that's not really the big question, right?
But I feel like actually it's very easy when you graduate from school to pick up on a program you don't know. You know, as you exit school. I think it's much, much tougher when you've been working for like 15 years on a software and, it's nobody uses it anymore and you got to switch and they're a complete different way to work. And by that, I'm, referring to, people who've been using, Form Z, what's the other one? Vectorworks.
Right.
AutoCAD, and now have to switch to a BIM program. That's a big jump, especially if you've been out of school for years.
Isn't Vectorworks a BIM program?
It is. I think it's a very popular one in Europe, but not so much over here. And again, one of the biggest thing is, how does that translate if you have to send a file to a consultant who's using another type of program? Yeah,
that's the biggest issue. So I think in terms of, if we're talking about just design itself, and we're not concerned with workflow, we're not concerned with hireability, we're not concerned with ease of communication between consultants and stuff like that. We're just talking about design. I don't really subscribe to the idea that you have to learn one program or the other to become a better designer. There are certain programs that will allow you to more easily do things for sure, like Grasshopper, obviously, for scripting and for producing scripts. So things that you want to...
parametric.
Yeah, parametric and modify many things at once on a kind of granular level. But so there are things that allow you to do other types of designs or other moves. And the argument that I think a lot of pro computer program designers have is that that's allowing you to, go further into the depths of the design. Like you're exploring new designs because you're using programs to get somewhere where you couldn't if you hadn't used Grasshopper, right? I don't know. I don't know if that's a reasonable substitution for critical thinking. I think it's a mistake to think that you can swap that out for critical thinking. And I think it's a mistake to think that just because you're doing something different, that it's good. And I think it's a mistake to think that just because you're using a technique that feels new, that somehow the design is validated because you couldn't do it without using that program. Well, that and the danger of learning, complicated program like Grasshopper, like parametric stuff, is that it takes a while to get into it, to get good at it, and it's kind of a video game addiction. I feel like you get good at it, so you just want to keep doing that, and then you slowly losing your design. What am I saying? You're kind of losing your criticism in the stuff that you design, and you just jump on the boat of Grasshopper parametric stuff, and then that's all you're going to be end up doing. Well, so I think there's two things that make it really difficult. The first is that I think if you're going to be a good architect, you have to love form. You have to be seduced and fall in love with form and shape and light and color and material and all these things. I think that's a necessary component of the architect. The challenge is that those are one facet of what it means to be a designer or an architect. And I think we allow ourselves to be overly seduced by those things sometimes, because we love it so much and we just want to go deeper into that. Because it's so amazing, the shadow and the light and the cool forms and the shapes and the graphics. And I get it. But of course, we all know that architecture is interesting because it lies at the intersection of many different kinds of professions and ways of thinking and issues. And if we accept that is the all those different things are what makes up an architect, then we can't allow ourselves to be fully seduced by one thing or the other. If you're going to be a truly capital A well-rounded architect, there are plenty of licensed architects who focus just on one thing, but I kind of say that they should be called architectural researchers and not architects. But that's maybe a different.
But I feel like it's kind of like, a painter that has different brushes and different techniques available to him or her, right? Mm-hmm. You can get really good at using one type of brush and one type of technique, but then you just end up repeating the same recipe over and over, or you really think about what you want to create and then pick the tool that's appropriate for that.
Yeah.
So I think, knowing all of those programs is great, but at the end of the day, it should really be what is your intent, what do you want to do, and which one offers you the best way to get there.
Yeah, and we don't have the luxury to not think that way because we're not artists. The things we produce don't exist in a safe space. They don't exist at a gallery. They don't exist just to question. They exist to also propose solutions and provide, functional answers to things. So you if you are an architect, you have, by definition, you have the responsibility to not allow yourself to be overly specific and to allow one tool dictate the majority of the design thinking, I think. I think you have to maintain balance.
Yeah, and I think that those programs are there to help you be more efficient in your process. Give you like more iteration quicker, so you don't have to build a physical model to see how it looks like, mm-hmm. or have a more efficient workflow to get stuff done faster. I
think it's one of the other big questions is maintaining the balance in terms of your skill set. So the real problem is that there's only so much time you have to work. And so I think so if the question is schooling and how much time you're going to spend learning X, Y, or Z, right? It's become more challenging in a way because there are more programs to learn and the programs are becoming more sophisticated. And so if you have 100% of time and you previously allocated 20% of time to computer programs, but now with that number of programs increasing and their complexity, now the student has to allocate 60% of their time to learning programs. Well, you're eating into time for something else. And that is the truth, because there is only so much time in the day and so much time you can put forth and effort into learning different things. So the question you have to ask yourself always is, where is that balance? Where's that threshold between learning X, Y, or Z? Computer software, hand drafting, physical modeling, reading other stuff, theory, and all the other 50 different things you're meant to be thinking about as a to-be architect. And that's the challenging thing, right? Maintain that balance between your ability to critically think and they call that more design part of the brain versus the part of the brain that's relying on technical skills, a skill set. And that's really challenging.
Yeah, I think, this conversation about program could be addressed to students and could be addressed to professionals. For the students part, I would say don't bother learning all of them. It's really not necessary. Get, an appetizer course on the ones that you think are more interesting to you, or that could be more beneficial to the projects that you're trying to accomplish. And don't worry about knowing them perfectly once you come out, because no matter what, you're going to learn them as a single user with your own workflow. Once you jump into the professional world, each office has their own way to use those programs, depending on the size of the team, the size of the project. So, I would say don't stick to AutoCAD, because AutoCAD is the old way to do things. Now there is BIMs. So yeah, knowing how AutoCAD works is good. You don't need to be an expert at it. Knowing how Revit or ArchiCAD works is good, but again, you don't need to be an expert at it. So
I think, okay, so let's be really clear. The fundamental programs that you probably should know, or at least have your hands in, typically would be AutoCAD, Rhino, SketchUp. But SketchUp is so rudimentary that if you know Rhino, then you know SketchUp almost by default, because it's so basic. And then beyond that, perhaps Grasshopper, if you're into that kind of stuff, and then BIM programs a little bit. But But it's almost, in terms of hiring, what I've found, and this will change in the upcoming decade or more, is that let's say the person you're speaking with is of the older generation and they did only hand drafting when they were in school. And that's, the era they're from. So let's say 50 years old or older, right? If they see on your resume that you have, Rhino, SketchUp, Grasshopper, AutoCAD, right? But they're looking someone that has Revit capabilities, and you're fresh out of school or a younger designer, you can probably sell to them that you'll be able to learn it really quickly, and it's not a problem. Unless they're looking for a high-level Revit expert, then that's not you, so don't worry about that. But if they're looking for, if that's like one of their qualifications, but really they just want a good all-arounder, and you don't have that BIM experience, you can probably convince them by saying, hey, you know what? I know 5-6 different softwares. I've learned these. I can learn a new software easily. I'm confident I can learn BIM. I've maybe used it a couple of times in school. Even if you use it just for like a week or so, it tells them that you have your feet wet with that program. And then for them, because they don't know anything about the programs at all. They probably don't know how to use Photoshop even. Maybe they do, but they don't know the nuances of all these different programs. So say, okay, yeah, fine. I believe that you're young. You're from this generation. You pick up stuff. I get it. So we can hire you. Well,
and if you apply to a much bigger office that uses a BIM program, oftentimes, they would train you for a week after you get hired.
Yeah, big offices, yeah.
So I would be confident with that.
But it is for sure true that if you are able to include some of these more popular softwares like Revit on your resume because you've used it, it makes a difference in terms of power. It makes life easier to find the next job.
Well, you're a short step ahead of people who don't.
Yeah,
so
it's like a quantifiable thing on the list. So that can be helpful. But I think it's important that you realize you might have to dedicate time to learning a software, and that learning curve is super frustrating because if you've dealt with software programs before, you know that if you don't know something, it's impossible to figure it out unless you happen to find an easy tutorial.
Yeah, the good thing though is that, between the time we went to school and today, YouTube has now millions of tutorial videos on how to use those things. I remember when I learned Revit in school, like over 10 years ago, there's nothing out there. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. It was just like you and your computer and your own questions, and that was it,
Yeah, and that's a good point, too, because if you're thinking of using a software for something and you don't really have a lot of different experiences, consider the ones that are the most popular because they're going to have the most tutorials. Yeah. And that the same thing goes with versions. People upgrade to Rhino version 5 or, I don't know, 6 or whatever it is, and you go to the tutorials, I know the interface is different. The same thing also when you're considering of using the Mac side versus the PC side for certain programs, and Rhino is the most common one, let's say. So if you're a student and you buy a Mac because you like that it's sleek and cool and it's a designer thing, and we all appreciate that, and you're trying to use Rhino on the Macintosh side instead of Windows, it's like the worst thing ever because the interface doesn't match any of the tutorials. So that eliminates 95% of the help content in the world that is actually pretty good a lot of the times, inaccessible or really difficult to make sense of. So if I would have, so I've had students do this and it drives me insane. Just abandon that, go to the Windows side because it'll make your life easier.
Yeah, and to do that, you can use the software called Parallels. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. It's very easy. You don't have to split your hard drive and boot on the Windows side. You could just switch by clicking on one icon versus the other. And
I don't know why they make Mac programs. I don't know why Rhino InDesign, a lot of programs, but why did they make the Windows version and the Mac version radically different? It's not necessary.
It's to punish people.
For using a Mac?
For using a Mac or using a Windows. But, talking about how much time you should spend on learning programs in school, I think the most crucial one I would advise to spend time on while you're in school would be the Adobe Creative Suite. Because I feel that's things that people don't really teach you once you start working in an office. You can learn BIM program, AutoCAD, Rhino, and all that while you're in an office, by having a coworker who's experimented, because they understand that you might not know it really well. But the Adobe Suite, I feel it's, if you know it well, when you start working, it just makes everything more efficient and smoother. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people don't know, in offices, how to use them properly. Like, the exporting PDFs and the thing is huge, or there is stuff missing, or they don't know you can do this and that. So I think I would advise spending more time learning those in school.
I mean, it's kind of a funny thing because we have to know all these different programs, but we only need to know them well enough to do what we need to do. And obviously there's kind of flaws with that kind of ideology because at some point you can become limited by your tools. So, but that's interesting you point that out. I mean,
like I feel like let's say the workflow in an office that uses AutoCAD or Revit, right? They have their stuff figured out, how things plot, their layers, like how to name the files and all that stuff. But for Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator, it's much looser. There's no standard setup.
Yeah.
So if you have someone who doesn't know how to work properly or correctly on this program, you're not going to learn it the good way. It's not going to be efficient. So if you have that really set up really well, I feel like that you could always, jump out of those BIM program, export an image and do whatever you want to do to enhance it to be what you want it to be if you know those 3 programs really well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also interesting because when you get to the office setting, I think being a type of designer who knows a little bit about all the different programs is very useful. If you're kind of like a jack of all trades, but with computer softwares, that's a very desirable candidate for offices, especially small offices, I would imagine, because you can kind of, do a bunch of different things, maybe not at a professional level. So let's say rendering, you might not be able to do obviously like a D-Box or one of the other company renderings, but you'll do something that's good enough for like an interim meeting or good enough just to pitch an idea. And then you can easily go back to producing a slideshow, producing a quick video, a walkthrough, and doing whatever. Those are very desirable candidates, but also there are offices, especially I think mostly bigger ones, who they have a team of people who are going to do the heavy lifting.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, I think it's worthwhile to know a little bit of all these things, but how much of an expert you need to become in the realm of rendering, let's say, I don't know, unless that's what you really want to do, unless you feel like you really need to be good at rendering because that's how you're going to express your design ideas and projects. And if you feel that way, then go ahead and do it. But in terms of acquiring skills just to become more desirable in an office and more productive in an office, I do think there's limits to how much of an expert you want to be. And let's say also if your true passion is design and not any of these more technical specific tasks, and when I say design, that means you're more of an overseer of many things as opposed to being the in-house renderer, right, or the go-to renderer, then that's actually a reason to not be an expert, or to be an expert but not tell them you are, right? Because you don't want to become the rendering dude or the SketchUp guy. If you're the SketchUp guy, I don't know what kind of office you're at, or the BIM guy or whatever. It can get you the job and make you more sellable. But in the day-to-day, I've seen where people who have learned those things thinking it's going to help them,
they get pigeonholed in one thing.
Yeah. So where that balance is, it's another tricky thing, and I don't have the exact answer, but it's something to be aware of once you've landed in the office. And if you're in a bigger office, so you can get away with not knowing stuff. Because they, like you said, they put a lot of effort into creating an infrastructure and a system within their office, and they take pride in the fact they have that structure there to support people and to educate people. So it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know Revit. The guy who hired me, I told him I knew Revit, but he's not around. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. And it's kind of like, and in a big office, they all get it. It's like, okay, yeah, we're going to go to Revit school. We'll pay for it for 3 days or whatever.
And again, I mean, even if you knew Revit, we've learned a little bit of Revit in school, then you start working on, tower projects where there is 15 people working on it with a shared model workflow and a bunch of, mechanical stuff that you have never seen before in BIM. It's a completely different approach. So even if you think you know it, you actually don't know it as much as these people who are using it every day for 8 hours do.
Yeah. So, I mean, and in terms of learning new programs, if you're using something for 8 to 12 hours a day, it only takes like a week before you feel kind of comfortable, and then 2 weeks before you for sure know way more than a lot of the project managers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's not a huge concern, I don't think.
The one thing I would say too, that if you're learning one of those programs or you want to make your process more efficient while working on this program, is to learn the shortcuts.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, like from the Adobe suite to like any of the architectural program, you don't want to drag your little mouse around and go click a window menu, show me this, show me that. You got to know like the shortest way to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think I've personally experienced that it's better for me if I'm trying to learn the shortcuts. Like that first week, I'm actually practicing learning the program.
Yeah.
You know, like try and print the list, find the list online, print it out, and try to just memorize it, because it would really make your process smoother.
Well, that actually reminds me of a few things. The first is that I think that what you're saying makes sense, but I think there is also, it could be a mistake to just learn the shortcuts and not look at the menus. And I've actually discovered this through teaching software, that the best way to first learn it is, if you want to memorize the shortcuts as you go, that's great, but also understand the logic behind the menus and their meaning. And I think there's a tendency for us when we jump into a new software, we haven't gone through a course and we're just doing it on our own, we kind of just go for it. The same way you buy a piece of IKEA furniture, and fuck the instructions, I don't need the instructions. And you get halfway through, you're like, nah, I kind of wish I read the instructions. It's the same thing with software. It's worthwhile to, as you're going through, not just crash through and do what you need to do from 0 to whatever skill level. It's to take a moment and look at the different menus and do some research and to say, okay, this menu is about these tools, so that when you're looking for something in the future, you have a rough idea of where it's going to exist. And I never learned programs that way. I was the former. I just fucking crashed through it, because I'm impatient. But really spending just a few minutes earlier on to think about the overall layout of stuff can save massive headaches later on. Yeah,
no, I think it's good to have, a few days where you're just exploring freely the program. But once you're done exploring everything that exists, learn the shortcuts.
The other thing about shortcuts is it reminded me that you absolutely need to become proficient at a piece of software enough so that it's not hindering your design thinking workflow. And that's another balancing act in my view, right? And of course, let's say if you're just starting off using a program, that's severely hindering your critical thinking part of the brain, to where it's 0, because all your effort's going into just figuring out, like, where the fuck is the tool that I need? How do I stretch this thing? And at some point that, after you learn more, that starts to tip in the other direction, and then things become easier and become smoother. And I think the challenge for the designer is to be aware of that. And I find myself in situations where I'm super frustrated because I have an idea if I want to execute something, but I can't because I don't have the technical knowledge. And other directions where I have the technical knowledge down really fast. I know the shortcuts. I can move super fast in the software, and I'm having fun going around. And I'm allowing myself to be tricked by the seductive forms and graphics that I'm seeing on the screen. And after 5 hours of doing that, I realize it's all shit because I didn't bother to sit down, sketch, or just think critically. Usually for me, it's through hand drawing for like 30 seconds, And this is the balancing act that I'm talking about, and that I think is difficult to be aware of, but you have to be aware of. That's the more conceptual. That's what I think of shortcuts.
No, it's true. It's true. Like I said, I feel like, those computer programs have some kind of similar addiction as video games. Mm-hmm. Like you could, like if you're drafting in CAD, let's say, you could draft in CAD for like 8 hours listening to podcasts and not actually being anywhere.
Yeah.
Just floating around, pianoing your hands on your keyboard and doing things like a robot. And that's the danger, is to be there.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why we do that is because we know, or we assume, or we don't know, it's a radical assumption that the final presentation will have to be produced digitally. as opposed to hand doing something, taking a photograph or scanning it. And so we kind of think, I think in part we believe that, well, if I have to do it in Illustrator in the end, I might as well just start there, and it's going to save me time. And man, that does not work. It never works that way. It never works that way. And even in an office, you know, if you're trying to get to the top of the office and be like a design director, let's say that's the position you're really aiming for. Not a PM where you're managing people and stuff and schedules, but a design director. How you will advance is through your design capabilities and your critical thinking and the good ideas and good design strategies you can put forth. And, you know, I would argue that a lot of times that can happen if you get sucked into the computer. What makes it even more difficult in an office setting is that a lot of places, they tend to work so that, how do I explain it? So like the design process is not as fluid as you might think. It's not as fluid as if you were on your own. So what happens is you're at your desk, you will produce a design option for this outdoor space or whatever, or the building, and you show it to someone above you who gives you feedback. And then you update that thing per their feedback and maybe do an additional option that you think. It goes back up to them and then maybe up to someone higher and then back down. So you have all these layers of hierarchy, and very, very soon, very quickly, you can find yourself turning off the critical part, the design part of your brain, because you know, in the end, I'm not making the final decision. So this other person above them is going to. So I'm going to revert back into the mode of, like you were saying, being kind of dazed out of my mind, listening to podcasts and just mindlessly producing options that they request, and maybe some crappy ones that I don't really believe in, but I'm not super invested because, again, I have no control at the end of the day. And that's that's totally understandable. It's happened to me. It's happened, I think, to everyone in an office to kind of fall in that mode, especially if it's a Wednesday afternoon. But you need to avoid it if you're trying to get to the design director position.
But that's why if you're good at using the programs, you can make the options that, you know, the upper people ask you to do look like shit and make the one that you think is more appropriate look really good.
Yeah, that's the tricky user.
I've done that before.
Yeah, you can do it with clients too, and your boss is your client.
You don't put as much heart into it, and it's obvious that it's not as successful, and then they admit that what you're proposing is better because it's ultimately better.
So I think we covered a lot so far, and I think in the really, I got nothing else to say. I had nothing to say. What else is there to say?
Well, the other thing is, so we talked about being a student, how should you prepare yourself and all that, but what if you are a practicing architect and like I said, you know, a lot of older generation have been on AutoCAD, right, for years. Now they have this big beast of BIM program and they're like, what the fuck? Like 3D and 2D and the same thing? Like, how is this? Well,
so BIM programs, building information model programs, they're fantastic because if you don't know, but we can explain it, I suppose. But basically, it's a 3D modeling program. But what's unique about them is that as you're producing the 3D model, it's also producing drawings of that model.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. So it's all one thing. It's not like a more typical workflow would be like doing your 3D modeling, you know, in Rhino, SketchUp, or whatever program, right? You have that, great. Now I need to produce 2D drawings.
Vice versa.
Either really nice or vice versa, or either really nice 2D drawings for design reasons or for construction documentation. Either way, there's a big split between those two softwares, and now you have to jump over from one to AutoCAD or AutoCAD to Rhino, and it's a real pain.
And as you change phases too, like you add more detail to either your 3D or your 2D drawings, it's a separate thing. It feels like a separate thing. When the 3D modeling, the BIM, you can add or hide layers of information as you go.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I get you. You're getting pretty far down into the advanced realm of things. Yeah, I know what you're saying. But going back out to the general thing of the profession, I think maybe there's this idea that like everyone's using BIM and everyone will soon be using BIM.
Everyone should be using BIM.
Right, but I don't think that's the case on the 2 points I made. I don't think it's as popular as people think it is. Maybe one day we'll get to the point to where, let's say, 85% of the offices are using primarily a BIM program, but we're far, far from that. And it's one, because professionals in this industry are slow to adapt new programs, especially ones that are radically different. And two, because BIM programs, they're not perfect. There are limitations to them.
Well, to that, like BIM program often costs way more money and take way more resource power from a computer than a 2D one, or a single 3D program. The other thing too is that it depends on your office types. How big is your office? If you're a one-man shop, you might not need to use BIM. If you're 200 people, you might definitely want to think about BIM, right? And then if you're using BIM, are you using BIM fully, or are you using BIM like you would use a 2D program? Like how much of the potential of the program are you actually using?
Yeah, and I think one big question is there are many practitioners who have been using some kind of computer modeling and then using AutoCAD. That's what they do. And a lot of places still just use AutoCAD.
A hybrid process.
And it might seem, maybe to the young designer, it seems outdated and antiquated to just use AutoCAD and then use SketchUp secondarily for 3D purposes and for renderings or whatever. And you think, that's not cool. They're fucking behind. They don't get it, yada, yada, yada. But drafting in 2D, hardcore drawing, whether it be fucking not ink on Mylar, but on a parallel rule,
charcoal on that cave walls,
on a main line, with trace paper or in the computer program. I think the younger generation underestimates how much designing can happen just in 2D, on a 2D piece of paper on a AutoCAD space, in AutoCAD space. You can pretty much do everything there. Now, the reason why I think a lot of younger designers think that they don't really believe that, or that's not their go-to, is because their minds are actually stunted. I have to say, probably most designers, their 3D visualization internally in their heads from 2D only. So you're working in 2D only, but you're visualizing what is in 3D is like dog shit. It's crap. And they rely on the 3D like a crutch to tell them what it is. Now, there are advantages to that, of course. You can see something for what it actually is, but that very important tiny part, an essential part of the brain that allows you to look at something 2D and more abstract and then imagine what is in 3D is so amazingly crucial, I think, to designing something like a building. And I think a lot of people are missing that now because they've been spoon-fed 3D information from day one, from Studio One, all the way up until through their education or whatever, and they don't know how to do it. So they get to the office. I'm going on a rant now, but they get to the office and they use AutoCAD to produce interiors in their house. They have no fucking idea what they're drawing. They don't even know how to. They see a drawing and they're confused. It's a completely foreign language. How is it that a 2D drawing, a floor plan, let's say, is foreign to an architecture graduate or a graduate who's been out of school for 3 years even? Yeah. How the fuck is that? It's because of all the things I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make it sound like BIM is the only way to do things and that we have to be using 3D modeling softwares, because there is a legitimate argument for saying that being able to survive and thrive just in 2D space is really important.
Yeah, no, and I think there is no shame of using, either or, right? It's really what
shame.
No, but I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, you're using AutoCAD and SketchUp, like you suck. Well, but you know what? If
your mom sucks. What about that?
But all right, okay. No, but I mean, if that suits you and your workflow, and you find your design equilibrium doing that, like that's great.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Somehow it is still pretty good, I think, that the 2D and the 3D are separate programs, because it forces you to be fully engaged in each of them separately. Like AutoCAD, you have to be fully engaged. Every single line that's going to be on a drawing that you've drawn in AutoCAD, you've made the decision of putting that line there. Every text that you put there, call out of on a detail, like you're the one who typed it. There's no like command like click and give me the info of this component. Like you had to know it, you had to research it, you had to make the decision for it. Same with the 3D. If it's a separate thing that you're building from your CAD plan or vice versa, you're going to have to think about what you're drawing up in 3D. How does that relate to your 2D? You know, you're going to have to make that switch. Like when you make a physical model and a plan, you have to think about those things. If you're in BIM, you could just build shit that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes you look at it in 3D, you're like, oh, wait, what the fuck happened here? Oh, well, you didn't picture it in 2D and 3 dimension when you made that decision. Or even worse, sometimes you have to make decisions because you have to build it in 3D, but you're not to that point yet. You shouldn't have to decide on those things yet because it's too early in your process to get there.
Yeah, too early in the process, and this is the more general problem with working at the computer, typically, is that the computer exists only to produce finite and very specific pieces of information. And in the design process, maybe, you know, you don't want to be so specific in every decision you make. This is where the big argument between hand sketching and drafting the computer comes in. When you draft by hand, you can fucking doodle. You can do weird things and sketch things and kind of explore. And in the computer, it's much more difficult to do. This is also where you need to become fluid and knowledgeable enough with the program to not have that interface gap, you know, to disrupt your thinking. But I think also sometimes when we work strictly in 3D or strictly in 2D, let's say in AutoCAD or Rhino, and we're craving to have it all at once, i.e. BIM, we think that'll solve the design issues for us, or that it will present things in a clearer way, so then the solution becomes clearer to us as well. So if I'm drawing something in 2D CAD, and I'm frustrated because I'm like, I need to see this in 3D. It'd be so much easier to see this in 3D to maybe to problem solve like a legitimate, like, you know, collision between mechanical and structural things, or let's say a design thing. Like I need to see the 3D space so I know if this is good or not. And I think we feel this, and I think we go to 3D, and then we realize that we still don't know the answer. And I'm not sure what that means exactly. My suspicion is that I think it's natural to the design process for that to happen on occasion. But I think it also means that we think that by having more information presented to us, that it's going to make the design process easier. Again, it's a substitution for imaginative thinking. Like I think, like in the example I described, if I saw it all at once, then I don't have to imagine it, and therefore I can just see what's good or bad. But maybe that's not the case. That's kind of getting kind of conceptual, but does that kind of make sense what I'm saying? Okay, so there's all of that. Then the big question for a lot of practitioners is, I have an office, we've been using AutoCAD, we have SketchUp and Rhino, you know, that kind of thing. Revit, I've been hearing a lot about Revit. Should I transition to Revit? And that's the big question, I feel like, for professionals. Not an easy question to answer for sure. I will say this, maybe it's obvious, but AutoCAD, SketchUp, and Rhino, they allow maximum flexibility. You know, they're raw digital space, so you can create anything much more easily. The issue with a lot of BIM programs is that they are designed to produce buildings, and then the question is, what the fuck is a building? And whoever created this software to create this quote-unquote building, what is their idea of a building? Maybe my idea of a building doesn't match theirs, and so therefore the kind of work that I want to do, probably, let's say, on the side of more sculptural or more formally adventurous, might not be easy to do in this BIM program. And that's a fair guess. That's a fair assumption.
That is one. I would say, to me, the way I would approach it would be, how much time can you dedicate learning to switch that program? And how much help would you need if something doesn't go the way it's supposed to go while you're working on a project? Yeah. Because I feel like a lot of those big programs could be very complicated. They could crash. They could, like, I think Revit doesn't do autosave or something crazy.
I don't remember. It's been a while since I've used it.
Or like backup files or something like that. So, you know, a lot of big offices who use those heavy programs have, what is it called? Like a BIM manager, right? Yeah. Somebody who's there to set up all of your standards, because it's not going to be the easiest thing if you're starting from scratch and you don't know the program. Set up all of your plot style, your title blocks, like all of the things that you used to use on the other programs. And that comes at a cost, right? If you need to hire somebody who's an expert to help you handle your hand, it's.
Wait, what?
I don't know what I'm saying. it's not much. No, but like if you need help, if you need someone to carry you through the process of making the big switch, it's a money thing. Yeah. And again, the subscription, the licensing, the staff that you're hiring, it's not going to be an easy switch. I just want to, put it out there.
So I would say if you're going to make that jump and you decide to do it, be ready to be very patient. You can't rush it. You can't force it. It's almost going, you can prepare for it, but it's going to kind of go at a speed that it needs to. I've seen offices also try to ease their way into the Revit program by hiring someone who's really good at Revit, and they think that's a way to, and that person who's an architect, they're not a BIM manager, they're not a BIM guru, but let's say they're really, really advanced in the program, or pretty advanced. At least that's what they say, right? I'll hire this person. They can do all the other stuff that we need done because they're an architect, and they can also do Revit. So they will run their own Revit program, and they'll bring someone else on the team, and they will teach Revit to that person in the process. And I'm telling you, is that a good way to get a teeny tiny sampling of Revit, like a tiny taste? When I say taste, I mean like not even a teaspoon. It's more like it's so tiny. It's like you dipped your toothpick in the sauce and then wiped the sauce off and then licked your toothpick after the sauce is gone.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
I don't know either. But it's a very small taste. So yes, you can do that to get a very small taste, but it's not an accurate depiction of the advantages of Revit, and it doesn't work because there's a big difference between someone who knows how to use something really well versus knowing how to teach it and to think structurally, to communicate it to the rest of the office, and to set up workflows and to problem solve. There's not there are like 4 different qualifications that a Revit manager, or not even manager, but helper or teacher or tutorial expert in the office needs to have that a user does not necessarily have.
And what if this person leaves your office?
Yeah, then you're fucked.
Then you're fucked.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that, switching is great. But again, money-wise, how are you going to bill your clients if you switch to BIM? You got to have that learning curve where things are going to take way more times than they used to do on AutoCAD just because you don't know how to do it, or you had a problem with it, so how do you, I don't know, that's actually a valid question. How do you bill a client on a Revit project versus a 2D project you were used to do?
It's a different process because...
Can you up your price because of that? Is the client going to understand? Do you need the right project to make that switch?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, it's all of those things, and I don't want to deter people from going over to BIM, but here's the thing too. I think if you are a sole practitioner, you have an office of like 2 or 3 people, you got work coming in, it's good. You're not, going to be losing people anytime soon, you hope. Knock on wood for the economy. And, you're in your like 60s or something, and you're thinking of making transition to Revit, don't bother. Just continue what you're doing. Just continue what you're doing. Because the BIM revolution, I think has been maybe oversold. And I think to people who are not in touch with all the rest of the architecture community, again, the sole practitioners, like it's not crucial necessary at this point. And as much as there's for sure huge advantages, which we're going to talk about. But if you're on your own like that in your own little world, man, that's just a headache. You're asking for a big headache. And unless you have enough cash to have, again, bring someone on board or to drop money very often to have support teams, that you can call or whatever. But other than that, it's a big change. Now, to some of the other more specific points, like you brought up with Revit, specifically, and we've said this before in introductions, it does take a lot of juice, computer horsepower. It takes a lot. So if you're running AutoCAD and SketchUp and that's it, don't assume you have enough, RAM and power to support Revit. All the offices I worked in that used Revit, everything solid state, not even a question, everything solid state, tons of RAM, and the memory chips and all the stuff is, from what I understand, I don't know that stuff really well, but when I talk to the tech guys, because I think they're kind of interesting to talk to because they're super weird, they're legit fast machines, and they're not cheap. So it's something you have to consider, and you don't want to put that program on a computer won't be able to handle it. Don't do that. That is a big, big no-no. It's a terrible, terrible idea. You'll waste more time than anything else.
Yeah, and I would also research, like programs, like how much they crash, because some programs have the reputation of crashing a lot. Mm-hmm. So same thing. If you are super busy, you don't have time to deal with that stuff.
Now, the BIM programs, though, are super advantageous in the longer term. So, like the scenarios describing with the person with the three team office, and they are 60 years old or whatever. Maybe not the ideal person to make a big switch if they don't have a lot of money. But if you're younger than that, and you're going to continue practicing, then it's something just worthwhile exploring, because it could of 2 years down the line save you a lot of time, and also be more appealing, but potentially to clients. And
I think I worked in an office, where we were maybe like 15 people, mm-hmm. and the goal was for the whole office to switch to Revit. So some of the staff was trained, everybody in the office was trained to switch on Revit. Mm-hmm. And we got a project that was supposed to be on Revit, and it was done on Revit. But by the time I left the office, not the whole office was working on Revit. Mm-hmm. Because even if everyone got the training and was semi on board on moving on to a new program, there is still a lot of reluctance from doing so, because you have to step out of your comfort zone. Right?
I mean, from the team members, from
some of the staff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've become an expert in CAD, your shortcuts, you can poop out a plan in 10 minutes, super quickly. Yeah. Now you got to learn that beast, and you have another, 10 years to work, or why would you step down to your level of comfort to
this is true.
Go to another program that you actually don't really see the advantage of, right? Yeah. So, if you have a bigger firm, you really have to, check with your employees and see who's really willing to make it work. Mm-hmm. Because also the training takes a lot of time and it's expensive.
That's a really good point.
And at the end of the day, it's an investment. For a firm, it is an investment. So are you and your team all on board of making that investment, or is it just going to be a huge waste of time and money, and
be really frustrating? Because let's not fool ourselves. The programs like Revit or even ArchiCAD, they are not the easiest area. We're not talking about Sketch. We're not talking about AutoCAD. We're not talking about Rhino. Like, these are really sophisticated tools, because doing a building is really fucking sophisticated. So if you're an architect and you're very aware of how complicated it is to do a building and all the different components, from representation, meaning producing CU documents, tags, and all this stuff, and the details and coordinating. And if you know that, then now imagine that there's this computer program that's trying to know all of those things and streamline it together. It doesn't mean that you hit a button and then it all magically works. What it means is that every little different possible thing that you would want to adjust in a final CD set and in the 3D modeling of the building, the ability to control that exists somewhere in the program. And the challenge is that, I don't know, let's say that's like 500,000 different tiny things, right? The challenge is that, okay, you have one thing you want to modify. You have to find it out of that 500,000. And obviously there's palettes and windows to make life easier, but this is the complexity of the program, far more complex than SketchUp, where there's like the number of variables is not 500,000. It's like 3, or something like that.
And sometimes there is, depending on what you're drawing and what you're doing, there could be bugs that happens, mm-hmm. right? Like things that just aren't right. And then you just start pulling your hair out of your head because you're like, how the fuck did I fix that?
Because the other thing with these programs, so in AutoCAD, like I said before, it's easier. It's better because it gives you more freedom, right? The downside is that it's not more control, but it gives you more immediate control and immediate freedom. Let's say that.
Sure.
The downside, of course, is that it's not efficient over the long run, because it's not a machine. Every time you're entering in more or less naked space, you have to recreate everything from scratch. more than like a BIM program. So that's the problem with AutoCAD. But the good thing is, like, if you're in the process, unless you have your AutoCAD workflow going and you hit a hiccup, something's not quite working, you can fucking just custom modify right there and just deal with it and move forward. A lot of BIM programs, they don't like that, right? They're set up to be used as they're meant to be used, and there's no like operating outside of the rules to get stuff done quickly. So if you're on a deadline, right, it's midnight, you just need to get this thing out, and you can't figure out this one, how to, again, 1 out of 500,000 things, you just need to change that one thing, right? AutoCAD, you just do it because it's all just lines, really.
Just exploded,
just
manipulated.
Fucking plow through. You can't do that with Revit and even ArchiCAD. Well, you can, but it's a really terrible idea because it'll come back and bite you in the ass for sure. So this is the other kind of change in thinking, is that a person, especially if a person's older, like you were describing, they know AutoCAD really well, and they know all the little tricks and little workarounds and stuff like that, the last minute stuff that might need to happen. You know, to get that level of knowledge, with the BIM program is much more difficult. And until you get to that point, you're going to want to take all these shortcuts, and you can't. It won't allow you. Right, it'll fight you every single step of the way if you try to do it that way, and that's something else I think you have to be aware of before you take something like that on.
But there is advantage to BIM. I mean, you know, the last project I worked on was a 30-story tower, and and that project was done in CAD. It was probably one of the last one of this size in my last office done in CAD instead of Revit. It was just on that threshold in the lifetime of the firm, and it happened to ended up on the AutoCAD side, and man, it really sucked. It just really sucked because you're doing CA and it's like, oh, we need to change, like a bathroom here or like a wall there. Well, you have 30 floors, you have to open 30 files, and you have to make the same stuff. I mean, thank God sometimes you can copy paste in place and it makes your life easier, but it's dumb. It feels like a huge waste of time.
Yeah.
If you're in BIM, you can make that move like way quicker. It updates everywhere. It changes your tags. It changes your sheets. You don't have to like do all these minutiae. So I think the effort that goes into AutoCAD in that story is more like doing the actual work, I could say, and the effort as opposed to the effort in the Revit scenario is not doing the actual work of like recreating the tags and stuff. It's just it's like working the program. So you're not working on the drawing, you're working the program to produce the drawing for you. You know what I mean? And both are going to take effort for sure. But once you get the BIM stuff set up and you're doing similar types of building types, man, it's smooth sailing. And that's where you see these advertisements for Revit or for ArchiCAD. It's like, oh, do a house in half an hour. Yeah, you can. Yeah, if you have a shitty house of one story and like a dumb roof, yeah,
if you have stuff set up, you can certainly do that. You can certainly get there. And with a program like ArchiCAD and their support team, they will help you get to that point. And I mean, the ArchiCAD and Revit, they're so sophisticated now that, when you choose, let's say, a slab tool or the equivalent of for whatever program, you have everything from all the different attributes of that slab, the thickness of the different layers, how it gets represented on different sheets, whether it appears or doesn't appear, everything. And both programs now, have kind of teamwork, so you can have different people working at the same time. So it's very promising, I'd say. I think we do need to emphasize again. There's a few big differences between the two programs, and I think one of them is that the speed. ArchiCAD does tend to be faster. We say this in introduction, and I know that they're a supporter or sponsor of our show, but I also don't want you to think, listeners, that we're talking about ArchiCAD in a positive way just because we have this relationship with them. Because first of all, we have this relationship because we like them. Not because of any other reason, really. If we didn't like them, we wouldn't have this relationship. Them and the people, but also the software. And we've used both programs. And, I've spoken to the head, what were the computer technical guy in charge? IT, but it's not back of house IT, like the person that's in charge of like softwares and like dealing with that stuff. as opposed to like truly back of house. Anyway, this person ran in a very, very large office, one of the most successful offices, really. And it came up, and the discussion came up of whether or not Revit or ArchiCAD was better. And the office was using Revit. And I asked them, I said, is there a future where you guys might transition to using ArchiCAD or using both? Because it was such a huge office, you could use both. And his response was interesting because he was like, well, if I had my way, we'd just be using ArchiCAD. And he said, because he just said it's better. He's like, it's better. It's easier to use. It's less headaches. It's all across the board is better. But
stress work for him.
Yeah, that's the thing too, right? That's a lot of it, right? And so it's kind of like you can trust the opinion in a way, because like, why would he do anything to make his life more difficult? But what happened was Revit was bought out by Autodesk, and so his description of it was like basically Revit was then shoved down our throats. Actually, that's what he said, shoved down our throats. And so now it's like what we're using. And I guess what happened was, in a similar way, Auto came out with the black background and the multicolored lines and kind of shoved it down everyone's throat, saying like, now this is, everyone, you will have to learn to see different line weights in color. Which, if you're used to using AutoCAD, you don't think about it because that's the way it is.
I love it.
It makes it clearer, easier for sure. But it's also, think about the fact that before that never existed, and then AutoCAD comes around and says, no, you have to, everyone in the engineering and architecture, everyone, you have to see lines in color now, right? Line weights in color. So he was comparing it to that, saying like it's the same thing. Said, but yeah, I'd love to use ArchiCAD. I think it'd be great. So there's someone else's opinion, who I guess you could say is trustworthy. So I think ArchiCAD is faster. It is a much more friendly user interface, I believe, and I think it's just as robust as Revit for sure. I think it's an easier way to work. Revit has this thing called families, and so like everything. It's been a while now, but like everything is. Everything you produce in Revit is part of a family or something like that. And there are no layers in Revit. And so the way
that always made me feel a little dizzy. I'm like, what? No layers? Yeah.
So like everything. So this is what I'm saying though, right? We're used to thinking about computer programs in terms of layers because we're used to name a program. Right? Because all the programs are about blank white space or black space, blank space, stuff you produce in it, and then that stuff gets assigned to a layer. You toggle layers on and off, or some variation on that. But Revit is such a wholly integrated system that doesn't even have layers. And that is when you're learning the program, that is a fundamental shift you have to be willing to accept and to work with. Otherwise, you're fighting with it the entire way.
Nope, I am not accepting it. Yeah, no, it's a different way of thinking. I feel like Revit is maybe a program that's more meant for very complex building with a lot of team from different field of profession working on it. Engineers, building managers, and
airports,
architects, like logistical. Like it's a pretty heavy program. When ArchiCAD seems to me more designed for architects.
Yeah, right.
It's not an engineering. It's not like a maintenance. It's not. It's meant to draw a building, help you out with like your CFAs and make your process more efficient without making it extra complicated. Because again, it always comes down to how much of the program's potential are you going to use, right? Mm-hmm. If you need all of the complexity, then go with Revit because it's going to give it to you. If you don't need like half of the complexity of Revit, then you don't have to go with Revit.
And that's the problem too in terms of user interface, not just interfacing graphics, but the workflow and how it feels when you're using the program, because it is a very intimate thing to have this tool that you have to use 12 hours a day or 8 hours a day or whatever. The difference between ArchiCAD and Revit feels like, in the case of Revit, the 500,000 different options that I was talking about are presented kind of all without hierarchy, in just a list fashion in black and white. Like, boom, here, right? Figure it out. Whereas in ArchiCAD, it feels like the more really specific and nuanced things that, are happening further down the line of thinking are further buried, and the ones that are going to be most likely the stuff you're going to want to try and use most often present themselves much more clearly.
Like it seems
and so I feel like they've worked really hard to make sure there's that fine balance. And that's a really difficult thing to do if you think about it, because how do you know which things are going to want to be at the surface more often unless you have the knowledge of an architect, right? Or you've really tried hard to bring in and embody the knowledge of an architect. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, I agree.
I know we said Revit takes a lot of horsepower, but fuck, if you're working in the computer and it just grinds to a halt all of the time, it's infuriating. It's infuriating.
Well, instead of time wasted during the day, you know what I mean? Like, it's not great. The other advantage of the BIM, like I was mentioning, is doing CA on it. I think really helps, finding the information without having to count how many ceiling diffusers you have on the 5th floor. You can easily get that data. And if your consultants are working in BIM too, you don't have to, imagine what the ductwork looks like in 3D when you're in CAD to see if there is a conflict with your beam above.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless I had a friend who was working on a project in Revit, and their consultant was also using Revit, the mechanical engineer. Except that they didn't give a fuck actually about, positioning the duct at the actual level he was supposed to be at.
Yeah.
So the duct always showed up on the floor. And every single level of the building. And
Duct
I was
floor.
just driving her nuts because it defeats the purpose of using such complex program.
Yeah.
At least punch the height at which the bottom of the duct should be at. You know what I mean? Because you're drawing it in 3D anyway, so you might as well go all the way. You can't go halfway. It doesn't make any sense. But that's a huge advantage, right? Because, like I said, mechanical, once you start adding the plumbing, the ductwork, the sprinkler system, and your structural, then you can actually see where are the conflicts. And sometimes the program will even highlight where the conflicts are for you, so you don't need to be all the way down into CDs and construction to figure out that there is a huge conflict on the 5th floor.
Yeah.
And now you have to make change orders and revisions, and it's becoming costly to everybody.
The other thing I was thinking about, I'm thinking back now to my time in the Revit program, is that if you really like looking in the 3D window a lot and orbiting around in the 3D window to view and critique your model that way, your design that way, Revit's not so great for that. It's super fucking slow. I mean, I know I keep saying it, but it's so painful. It's so painful. It's so slow. So much that you can't use it to think in 3D space. So if you're used to working in Rhino, let's say, and that's how you design in 3D, that's what you do. You don't really design in 2D. Don't expect to do the same thing in Revit. It's too slow. It's not even possible. So what I've actually found for the different Revit programs projects I've worked on is what happens is, actually, this is actually a really good point that I just thought of. I'm complimenting myself. Yeah, but it's an important one. That so we're talking about AutoCAD, Rhino, Revit, and ArchiCAD, right? So you think that if you use Revit, you don't need to use Rhino or AutoCAD anymore. Not true. Not if you're serious about designing. You can't design in Revit because the program is it's all about the system, and you have to use the system. And the system is very complicated, which means that which is very different from AutoCAD, which we can compare to a paintbrush if you're really good at it, or Rhino could be like a paintbrush. You can quickly manipulate form and do different things and think. It's much more fluid and intuitive. Revit, you can't, because the number of steps you have to take to do... What was that? The noise. Was that my stomach? My stomach. And the number of steps you have to take to do a simple thing is so many, and it's so slow that you find yourself not being able to think clearly. So either you will abandon Revit, or you will continue forward and the design will 100% suffer because the process is so fucked up.
Or you do a hybrid process, right?
That's what you have to do.
Right? You can, use maybe SketchUp just to manipulate the volumetry of your project. and then even do like a quick CAD plan just to like just get some lines, some dimensions very quickly. And then once, you have a good grasp of what it's going to be, then move on to the next phase into a BIM program. And I actually found this process more successful because there's something that's definitive about the BIM I think it's just constipating the conceptual phase of a design, again, because you already have to make all those decisions. When you just freely start playing with something where you have no strings attached, you could just erase everything, start again, it's fine. Or forget about it and create another file and redo it. I think it's just more successful.
Yeah, and that is the workflow. The workflow, I've always found, is to basically design as much as you possibly can in some other program that's more fluid, like Rhino, AutoCAD, or just old school by hand and cardboard, and then you go to Rhino or
like you
Revit.
Would never put like a hand sketch, a napkin sketch on a title sheet.
Right.
Like you would like make a napkin sketch, then maybe like grab a few pieces of cardboard, glue them together, see how it looks, and then maybe like start sketching it with a ruler and like an ink pen. You would like go through those like step up phases. You wouldn't jump to the end when you don't even know where to start.
Yeah, it'd be kind of like, if you're used to designing and it's like more fluid and you're open to ideas, you don't know where you're going. It'd be like that, and then all of a sudden having an assistant who's constantly asking you for like the engineering calculations. It's like, go the fuck away. I'm not thinking about that at that point. You realize we're not there yet. But you have to tell me. And before you can make any other decision, you have to give me a definitive answer. And so, it doesn't work. But so at every project I've been on, you design everything as much as possible in some other computer space, and then you recreate it in Revit. Because Revit does not like to easily modify things. So like at one point, we started building this. It was me or another team, I don't remember. But we had this model in Revit, right, this building. And we needed to move the building by a foot or something stupid. And so you think fucking select all, drag. Well, first of all, we knew that was going to be a problem because you can barely move one thing in 3D space without the computer not liking it. And then we realized like, no, don't do that. It's going to fuck everything up if you move it. I'm like, what are you talking about? I can see it. I know the command. I can select all, click, drag, move 1 foot. No, don't do that. All this talk and discussion and conferencing about how to do this. It's like, come on. And so the ease of how malleable the model is in Revit, really, really not malleable. Revit is ideal if you know exactly what you want to do, and then you do it, which is why you're designing another space. ArchiCAD, on the other hand, yes, does place more constraints than like in Rhino in a complete free space, but it's not as extreme as Revit. Revit is like either 0, you don't use it at all, or it's 100, you use it exactly what it is. ArchiCAD allows you the kind of more massaging capability. So before I was talking about how in AutoCAD you can kind of quickly do workarounds to get something done. You can do it in Revit, really difficult to do, bad idea. You can do it in ArchiCAD, much easier to do. It's more sympathetic, but still not a good idea. But so then, does that make sense? Like ArchiCAD is much more, it's more open to that kind of squish, and it makes a huge difference in the day to day. If you don't have a massive support team, you don't have the cash for that. You don't have a Revit, ArchiCAD expert on hand, or you just don't need, like you said, to do all 100 amazing things that it can offer. You just need to use it to make to increase efficiency in some certain areas. You can use it for that too.
Yeah. But then again, if you only use 5% of the whole program, and they come with a new version every year.
Yeah, that's tough.
That's the other thing. Those programs changes really fast. They keep making new versions because technology improves. They get complaints. They try to better the programs, and it's so great. But you can easily be trapped into this like upgrading system, and it's those are expensive programs. Those are expensive licenses or subscriptions. So, once you step in that, you really have to think: is it worth the investment, or should they just go to something that seems a little more appropriate to what I need to do? The other thing too is with those programs, like you were mentioning, you can work in like 4 different views at the same time. So you can work in plan, but see your 3D, see your facade, see your floor plans. if you have all that on one screen, it gets a little crowded because between your palette tools, your menu bar, your email inbox that's open, your 4 windows, your YouTube or Netflix streaming, watching us.
The Midnight Strip podcast.
You gotta have at least 2 monitors just to make yourself like a little more sane and organized. And so you don't have to like toggle open and close windows like every single minute. So that would be another investment to add onto your list of what to get a second monitor.
And to all offices out there who don't allow second monitors because it doesn't look good in the office, go fuck yourself. That's what I say.
Dumb. Yeah, that's stupid. Just
dumb. And you also have to consider if you're the boss of an office and you're going to make this change and you're deciding between 2 different programs, Revit and ArchiCAD or whatever other softwares, I think you were saying you have to talk to your employees. I think that's a really, really smart thing, and not just make the change without consulting them.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, they're the one working on it.
And you also have to understand which is going to be easiest for them to work in to be most efficient. And, it's when a program is really... It feels like it's being confrontational with the user very often because it's taking too much power or it's not clear or whatever. Those minutes add up very quickly. And so people can spend half a day or an entire day very often just troubleshooting stupid shit, right? And I think from the employee's perspective, it's like, this is a fucking waste of time and it's annoying and it's something you bitch about with your friends, right? And as a boss, if you overhear, it's like, they're complaining, but it's like just office gripe stuff. But if you're translating that to hours, minutes, effort, and dollars, that's a serious problem. That's a serious problem because all that time spent wrestling with this program could have spent productively thinking about different options or doing other stuff. And I think this is a really big thing to consider as well. Another more specific one, comparing again the 2 BIM programs in 3D space, is ArchiCAD's 3D is much quicker. It uses, OpenGL, some kind of whatever thing. So it's super smooth. It's as smooth, if not smoother, or about the same as Rhino. So you can use it in that manner, which you can't with Revit. The other thing that I really, really like, and this thing does not exist native to any other program I've used, or native to Rhino, SketchUp. I've never used AutoCAD 3D, but I'm sure it's not in AutoCAD 3D. It's not in Revit.
I would throw up every time someone would open AutoCAD 3D. I'd be like, are you insane?
Take a look at yourself.
Are you like a masochist? Like, what are you doing?
I think you need to go to rehab. You have a problem. But in ArchiCAD, they have this, they call it the flyby
the video game thing.
And I know you don't care for it, but as someone who's played a little bit of video games online, it makes a big difference. So basically, most programs you can orbit around something, and that's the way you view things. You pan, you orbit, or you zoom and zoom out. That's it. The problem with orbiting, it means that you're always going around an object. Well, we're doing buildings. We don't just go around the building. We go through the building, through the hallways, through the rooms, up and down stairs. It's really hard to feel the circulation and the movement from a person's perspective of the building you've designed when you can only orbit.
So you can do the little camera things.
Yeah, but it's not as fluid. In ArchiCAD,
I don't know, the little up and down video game, like it's like, I'm gonna throw up.
In ArchiCAD, it's because you know how to use it.
Get your ginger before you do that.
In ArchiCAD, well, that's also because you get sick with basic VR, or AR. But in ArchiCAD, what happens is it's like a computer first-person shooting game. So your mouse becomes your head. You can look around, and then your left hand's used to toggle keystrokes to go slide left, slide right, move backward, forward, and up and down. You can lock different positions. And I'm telling you, if you're a person who likes to see what it really means to be inside of the space and to move like a person would in the space, this is, I would almost pitch ArchiCAD or use it just for that fucking tool. I'm serious, because it's so frustrating when you have sequences of spaces, right? It's a narrative spaces. You flow from this space to that room, and then the outdoor, then indoor, and you can't do it easily, and in the workflow of designing. You have this digital model. You can be inside of and outside of it, but you can't. You have to fucking orbit around stuff. That's
you can't
where
just put yourself in the middle and like scroll to move forward.
It doesn't. When you scroll, you always scroll too far, but you're not really moving. You're zooming. And the ArchiCAD thing, you're going through the model as if you would a video game, and it's a much clearer way to see things. I mean, I think it's a huge thing for me. I love it. I love it. It's like it's so much easier to understand stuff, and you're not understanding your design as this abstract sculptural model. Right? You're not understanding the inters from very select points of view. You're understanding it like all the way through. You know what I mean? I don't know why the programs don't have it. It's not difficult to incorporate. You know what I mean?
I think it's the fact that you have to use a keyboard to navigate. Like no one has been doing that since the past 30 years because now you have a mouse, you have even joystick, you have other things that are smoother than
joystick.
Like key punching to like move around.
You're not punching anything. It's W's to go forward, and then
you are punching things.
You don't punch. You just hold it down and you go forward. It's the most intuitive thing. You've played Halo. How do you have a problem with this?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know. It makes me very dizzy. It's very like staggered, like not smooth.
It is smooth. What the fuck are you talking about?
I don't know.
But anyway, so I think that's. I mean, it's a really specific thing, but it's always stuck with me throughout my entire career. It's like, why don't other programs have? Why doesn't SketchUp have it? Why doesn't Rhino have it? Why isn't there? Maybe there's a plugin I don't know of, but so that's something else to consider.
SketchUp actually has a ton of plugins, developed by companies, but also developed by just gurus of SketchUp, like geeky people who love it and like come up with stuff. And it's actually pretty amazing in that sense. Because it feels like it's a pretty bare bone program, but that you could really enhance the way you use it by how other users are thinking about using it.
Yeah.
And I really like that about SketchUp. It's like you can always find a little tool to help you out.
Yeah.
That's friendly enough and simple enough,
And SketchUp's good too, because if you need to, model your apartment to see if furniture fits, it's it's quick. You open it, you do it. Yeah. And that's it. Should we wrap it up? I feel like we're coming to a point where it's a natural ending to the conversation. Okay,
yeah.
Okay. I don't know. No.
That's a very abrupt way.
I need to use the bathroom. Okay, so look, we covered a lot of different things. I'm sure there's stuff we didn't answer. So reach us at our hotline. It's 213-222-6950. 213-222-6950 for any questions about this. And also we have what?
Slow down, God.
Also, we have future episodes about interviewing, how to do an interview, and what was the other one? Oh, yeah, passing the architect registrations exams, the AREs, and we're going to cover those things. So really important, reach out to us, leave a voicemail with questions or advice. If you disagree with something we said or have advice for people on how to interview, or maybe you have a fun anecdote about interview you experienced or was about software. I don't know if there's any fun anecdotes about software, but if you do, then call the number and we'll get the dialogue going. Yeah. All right. So thanks for listening. We, of course, are on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Subscribe to us in those places. And the big thing, aside from calling the hotline, is leaving us a review in the iTunes or Apple Podcast app. That is the best way to support the show and spread the word. And other than that, we have a website. It's midnightcharrette.com. Thanks to our sponsors, supporters. Thanks to you for listening. Anything else?
That's it. This is the end.
This is the end. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.